So I want to start off by talking about some pop culture subjects that have been percolating around in the crease between pop culture and politics that I think you all are kind of uniquely qualified to weigh in on. And to start out with, I wanted to ask you about, this isn't too broad, what you make of the state of Black American politics, given that we've had some pretty diverse political outcomes in the last couple of weeks. On one hand, we have India Watson being elected as mayor of Buffalo. On the other hand, we have Eric Adams, former cop, one of the more conservative candidates in the Democratic primary, being the likely winner, the likely future mayor of New York City. And there have been a lot of hot takes about what this means about the future of socialism, what this means about what Black Americans do or don't really want. And I wanted to throw that question to you. What, if any, lessons can we draw from these recent outcomes?
I mean, as the non-American in the room, let me just step right in and speak over everybody else when I say it kind of proves that the Black American body politic is as diverse as any that you'll find. And to try to have conversations about what it is the quote unquote Black community wants or what it expects, to me, it's always been a futile conversation. But the nature of democratic politics is such that any group who's not white, but especially with Black people, gets compressed into this bolus of white liberal understanding. And it always looks like whatever it is that the party leadership believes that Black people want, whether it's increased policing, whether it's, cutting or offering school choice through vouchers, whether it's cutting social services, whether it's, operating under the guise of offering employer choice and employee choice, but really what it looks like is deregulation and union busting. They'll essentially take whatever liberal narrative is necessary and then apply a veneer of kufis and kente cloth to it and call that the Black body politic. And I think what this shows is that there are poles of political choice in Black communities just like anywhere else. So with Adams being elected in New York, being a former cop and being sort of a farther to the right, a center-right candidate, and then Buffalo being the closest American city to where I am. I'm just outside of Toronto, Canada. The fact that they elected a Black woman socialist as mayor, to me, are some incredible signs of progress. But it also shows that we're not a monolith.
Pascal, I mean, you host a podcast, This is a Revolution podcast. What do you make of the revolutionary potential of our political moment coming off of last summer with the largest number of people mobilized in the streets in American history, global outrage over George Floyd that, resulted in a Joe Biden presidency and potentially war on crime part 2? Do you think that there was true revolutionary potential in last summer? And what do you think's happened to it, if so?
It's actually fascinating that you asked that question because we had Dhoruba bin Wahad on our show on Saturday. And for those who don't know, Dhoruba bin Wahad is one of the founding members of the Black Liberation Army with Assata Shakur, former Black Panther Party member, as well as a lifelong revolutionary nationalist. And the subject matter of the show was what is the revolutionary capacity of Black America in the post-COVID era. And to be quite frankly, Dhoruba was not romantic at all about he was very, very, very dour in saying that I don't think in the current reality that there is much revolutionary capacity for Black America at all. What we're seeing with these kind of hashtag movements is that they become rendered to foundation funding rather quickly and become, I wouldn't even say co-opted, because I think many of them were actually auditioning to become another fulcrum of the left flank of capital in the overall liberal hierarchy, and they really weren't positioning themselves to be revolutionary at all, per se. And quite frankly, I think that because most of these movements are still rooted in leveraging a collective notion of Black identity to be racial ventriloquists for the quote-unquote collective community, that they're still stuck in another phenomenon that we talk about on our podcast in creating the politics of containment for Black America, in that you have the majority of Black people who are undemocratically having racial ventriloquists speak for them while they can't choose their own political ideology, thoughts, positions, and decisions, and that allows the ruling class to dispose of black people in one unique and simple kind of way, and basically negotiate on terms that fits the ruling class to their benefit, and oftentimes to the detriment of the black majority. So I would argue, quite frankly, that the foundation world is and the corporate world is pouring tons of largesse into quote unquote black media and other black nonprofit organizations and HBCUs, but I don't think the majority of black Americans who are poor and working class are going to see any benefit from that at all. And I think that's the overall problem with black politics, is that it's not a working class politics. It's a class politics of petit bourgeois PMC blacks who have nothing in common with the actual material reality of the majority of black people who are actually working class.
How do you imagine that changing? What do you think would have to happen for there to be a different outcome? Because it seems to me, and I could be wrong, that there are some cracks that seem to be forming here where the ventriloquism that you describe isn't as well executed, right? The extent to which the PMC, black bourgeoisie are able to speak for the majority of the population doesn't seem to be going over quite as well when I look at the comment section on random pop culture websites and see people criticizing Biden and asking, where's my stimulus and what's been going on. When I see the way that certain members of Democratic leadership have come under critique by, again, just regular black people who, because of the internet, are able to be kind of seen and heard more directly than perhaps in years past, who are over the kente cloth kneeling and who are over the representational politics and who are frustrated that the anti-Asian hate crime bill got passed, but the George Floyd crime bill, as anemic as it is stalled, who are not tolerating some of the excuses coming out of the Biden campaign about why the voting rights bills, et cetera, haven't been passed. Do you see any potential to kind of break open or let's say, pull down the veneer that these ventriloquists have been relying on for so many decades?
Well, actually, it's a really good question because it's actually the subject matter of a book I've been working on that I'm actually trying to put together. And the title of the book is Fracture, from Obama to Trump and the Crisis of Black Politics. And the main point, and what you're talking about, is that fracture that I'm trying to discuss in the book, and what are the phenomenon that cause that fracture. One of the main reasons, one of the overarching reasons, is that there's a generational shift. Black people under 40, or what is normally known as millennials, are a generation that have no connection to any of the goods or patronage or policy decisions that the Democratic Party had made when the New Deal Civil Rights Coalition was in place in the 60s, that at least allowed even middle-class blacks to get affirmative action, minority set-aside contracts, corporate jobs. Even my generation, I'm a little bit older than everyone else here, who were able to get corporate jobs or decent education, so on and so forth. What you find is that younger coterie of blacks who come out of the millennial generation, they're graduating from, say, Howard undergrad with an MBA from an elite grad school, and they're graduating and they're like, I can't get a job. All my friends are working at Starbucks. Their white cohort ends up saying, well, I can't get a job. My friends are working at Starbucks. I'm voting Bernie Sanders. But because the ventriloquism and the ideological superstructure of black politics renders black people to be put in the right wing of the Democratic Party coalition, while now for the first time we have white progressives to its left, the only option these kids are getting is hot black faces in high places, Chucks and Pearls, Kamala Harris. But initially they were, down with Obama. But what happens is that my position is this: the failures of the Obama presidency to translate into material policies that actually benefited large segments of black America are what is the key point of causing this fracture you're talking about. And because millennials bore the brunt of that failure, they're the ones who are more willing to exit from that collective sense of racial ventriloquism that has been a hindrance to black politics going back to the ages of Booker T. Washington.
So that feels right. And the generational divide certainly lands home with this geriatric millennial that you're speaking to right now. But something that frustrated me on the Bernie campaign was that there was all of this really breathless discussion about how the younger generations are with us. That sometimes felt like it was excuse making for why we weren't trying harder to get an older generation that is absolutely required for anyone to actually win. And sometimes I wish some of our messaging materials focused less on how great it was that young people liked us and worked harder to explain to older people what Bernie's agenda held for them. So I guess my question is, it's great that there's a generational shift happening, but for people who don't want to have to wait 5, 10, 15 years for that to manifest politically, and who question whether or not it will in fact manifest politically in 10, 15, 20 years, given that sometimes people start to become more conservative over time, what can be done now to activate particularly older Black Americans, in your opinion? And I want to make sure that Dr. Mocombe gets in.
Well, what has to happen is that people who have progressive politics, or if you want to call them this new left, if you will, the kind of DSA Sanders left coterie, including the Black left, have to penetrate the ideological superstructure of Black politics. What does that mean? Why is Jim Clyburn able to leverage his constituency to get them to say, we're not choosing Bernie, we're choosing Joe Biden? Because Jim Clyburn has the phone number of every grad chapter of every fraternity and sorority member organization in his Rolodex. He has every Black church, major mega church pastor in his Rolodex. He has all the HBCU presidents in his Rolodex. The ideological and social infrastructure of Black politics revolves around many of these petit bourgeois organizations and institutions because the thought leaders of these Black communities, plural, attend these institutions. Because he's able to leverage concessions that he gets from the Democratic Party in terms of patronage. I have a pejorative word for it. I call it fatback and biscuits. In terms of patronage to dole out to these sectors, he basically is allowed to get their willingness to follow his leadership in exchange for the patronage and concessions he gets from the Democratic Party. That ideological superstructure has to be pierced. And I think one of the problems that we have as those who consider themselves on the left or interested in working class and materialist politics is that many of our white left cohorts don't understand how class works in the Black community, or they don't take it seriously. They don't understand what are these membership organizations, these fraternities and sororities? How do they work in the Black community? What is their role? What is the role of the Urban League? What's the role of all of these legacy organizations, and how do they create this organizational superstructure in the Black community? You know, who's going to Martha's Vineyard every summer? Like, there are Black people who go to Martha's Vineyard? Of course there are. So, unfortunately, because of the trope of seeing Black people as one collective underclass clouds the ability of people to understand the internal class sophistication that exists amongst Black people like any other people. They don't realize how that class hierarchy is able to maintain the ideological superstructure of Black electoral politics to have the fidelity that we now have, where for the first time in modern history, Black people are in the right-wing fulcrum of the Democratic Party, where we have white progressives to its left. And learning how to penetrate that is what needs to be done.
Yeah,
Brianna.
Please go ahead. No, please go ahead.
I won't be as long-winded as Pascal. I think we're trying to get me into the conversation, but what I would say, I'm a little more radical than anybody else on the panel. My position is I don't believe in something called Black politics. I think people known as Black Americans, African Americans, according to the dialectical materialist structure by which the capitalist structure by which America is constituted. And therefore, they're divided between a right-wing nationalistic capitalism that's very fascistic. And then on the other hand, you're caught with the left on this identity politics, a neoliberal identity politics. So for me, and this divide is a distinction that Marcuse, and I'm going to use this real quick as an example. Marcuse made the distinction that's Herbert Marcuse of the Frankfurt School. He wrote a book called Soviet Marxism, in which he tries to juxtapose Soviet Marxism with American capitalism. He argues that there's no difference between the two. So essentially, there's no difference between a neoliberal capitalist superstructure or capitalist form of organization and a right-wing fascistic, nationalistic form of trying to organize American society. That being said, for me, any alternative, so for me, Black politics does not offer a counter-hegemonic form of system and social organization to what we contemporarily have. In fact, it reflects what we contemporarily have. So anything that doesn't take into the existential crisis that we're facing, and this existential crisis for me is climate change and the impact that climate change has on our species, on the world itself. Anything that does any movement, any form of system and social organization that does not take that into account is not counter-hegemonic. So for me, we have to transmogrify the entire system itself. There's no need. This focus on left politics, right politics is obsolete. So as Francis Fukuyama, we are at the end of history. The end of history is calling for an alternative form of system and social integration that neither Black politics is pushing for or white politics. They're similar. So that's where my position is. I don't buy into this whole notion of a Black politics, brown politics. In fact, I don't care for it. I think it's just identity politics and post-industrial capitalism. So we have to come up with an alternative form of system and social integration. Now, how do we do that? Do we have time to do that is the fundamental question.
Well, I want to ask the question that you just posed. How would you go about doing that? Because I will confess that the reason why I'm attracted to a certain kind of Black politics is that in the wake of the last year or so, since the end of the Bernie campaign, I personally have become kind of frustrated with the limit to the political imagination on the left and the very quick pivot to talking about how exigent all of these concerns were when it looked like Bernie was about to be president. And suddenly people who are leaders on the left talking about common sense, social democratic programs like Medicare for all, like they're these pie in the sky things that no one should even begin to start asking for another 20 years or so. And the one place where I still feel some semblance of radicalism is among Black political actors. And there's a sense of exigency there that I think comes from the fact that, like every crisis in America, it is disproportionately concentrated on historically marginalized groups, namely us. So maybe it's just my naive last reservoir of hope. But my thinking is that because of the way that neoliberalism has empowered identity to serve its own ends, that there might be some sliver of opportunity there if it were the case that left movements, instead of being personified by someone like Bernie Sanders, were actually personified by the Black faces who, because of the way identity has been put on a pedestal by neoliberals, it offers us a little bit of protection from the kind of slings and arrows that the Bernie movement got in terms of being undermined on the basis of those same identity politics.
See, for me, if the purposive rationality of those who are pushing identity politics is for equality of opportunity, recognition, and distribution, for me, that is not counter-hegemonic, because you're basically simply seeking to integrate within the current system as it is established. Mm-hmm. Now, with the left has become a reformist left, building on Bernstein. The whole notion is a form of socialism that adopts, that has a veneer of capitalism that is also problematic. Any side that is calling for a counter-hegemonic system to what we're contemporarily facing has to speak to this deconstruction of all of the institutions. Because if you take what Althusser is arguing about, how we have to move away from a materialist mark to more of the ideological superstructure mark, because the institutions and the ideological apparatuses are put in place to buttress capitalist relations of production. Now, if those institutions are in place to buttress capitalist relations of production, the only way to reconstruct contemporary society is to deconstruct the current institutions. So under the fundamental, defunding the police is a movement towards the deconstruction of the police force. Deconstructing education, as Paulo Freire calls for, implies that we have to remove the administrative aspect of education and focus more of a teacher-student-oriented education. We have to, and this is going to sound a little radical, we have to get rid of the state. And I know that sounds a little bit anarchist on my part, but yes, the state is in place to buttress capitalist relations of production. Now, reformist Marxists or reformist socialists will argue, well, no, we can use the state to implement socialism. No, that hasn't worked. Empirically, it has not worked. It didn't work in the Soviet Union case. It hasn't worked on the Chinese case, because the Chinese have, you can't call what the Chinese have socialism. It's state capitalism at its core. So for me, we can't speak about reform. We can't speak about identity politics. We have to speak in terms of deconstruction of the institutions that are in place to buttress capitalist relations of production.
So I'm sympathetic to much of that. I guess my concern is that sometimes, while ideologically I would agree, I'd like to talk in a little bit more concrete terms and kind of movement-oriented terms about what that looks like, and how people listening to this can participate and also know what to look out for in terms of movement leaders, people who hold themselves out as ventriloquist representatives of movements, so that they can disentangle what is kind of good faith activism to deconstruct some of these systems that I think are limiting, and to what extent efforts of reform are reformist. And so I want to ask you, I mean, Pascal was talking about the fact that there is this misleadership class, that, you know, the Jim Clyburns of the world they have an enormous amount of power. Arguably, Jim Clyburn won the election for Joe Biden. And I'm glad you brought him up, because right now, Jim Clyburn and the CBC PAC have intervened in the election of, or the race for Ohio's 11th district with Senator Nina Turner, endorsing and now funding, and with piles and piles of money, her opponent, Chantel Brown. And so he continues to be this toxic influence, which only recently gets any pushback from the mainstream media, in part because he is able to use the protection of identity and the legacy of being, you know, a civil rights icon and all of these things to ward off substantive criticism. And I wondered what each of you thought. I wanted to play a clip of a recent back and forth that he had with Mehdi Hassan on his show, which is one of the only instances that I can recall where a mainstream media figure has offered any pushback to his self-identification as a progressive.
You have been quite critical of the left of your party. The Democrats lost a net dozen House seats last November. Despite winning the White House, you've been very critical of the party's progressive wing for, quote, sloganeering, you say, with movements like Medicare for All and defund the police. In May, though, Congressman, a focus group study from the polling firm Lake Research Partners found that swing voters paid only a little attention to Republican attacks on socialism or defunding the police, which they viewed as divisive fear-mongering, and that the bigger problem was that many voters didn't have a clear grasp of what the Democratic Party stood for. So is the whole attention on defund the police really a deflection by the party leadership from your own failures? That's what your critics on the left would say.
That is absolutely poppycock. I know what I'm talking about. I'm out here with the voters every day. I did a town hall meeting last night in Jasper County, South Carolina. I can tell you, defund the police is a non-starter, even with black people. And if you don't think that's true, then look at the results of what just happened in New York City's election. So the proof is in the pudding. I know what I'm talking about. I talk to people every day. And defund the police is a chokehold around the Democratic Party. And let me remind you, if you're going to categorize left and right, I'm on the left of my party. Nobody can call me anything but a progressive. And been one all of my life. Met my wife in jail, being progressive. So come on.
Clyburn says it's poppycock that he's anything other than a leftist, and that because the other corporate Democrats told him that defund the police was the problem and not corporate Democrats like Nancy Pelosi, that in fact is what caused Democrats to lose to not be as successful in the midterms as they would like, or as successful in terms of congressional elections as they would have liked. Pascal, I saw you were having some facial expressions
I'd like to know how much the big pharma checks he's catching.
I was just going to say, his biggest funders, Jim Clyburn's biggest funders, are literally the pharmaceuticals, insurance, and healthcare industries are his biggest funders.
Jim Clyburn is the epitome of what we at Black Agenda Report have called the Black misleadership class, or what I call the Black political class. He is literally a big pharma paid stooge, and his whole purpose is to leverage the South Carolina primary to make sure that whoever the backers and funders of the Democratic Party, financial services, insurance companies, real estate developers, corporate institutions, the military industrial complex, the foundations, whoever they are, which is who the Democratic Party actually responds to, that's the person that wins the South Carolina primary. He is the most egregious example of everything that is wrong with black politics, and he's the last person that anyone should take seriously. This is the same guy who was talking about, I don't know no black socialist with a statue of W.B. Du Bois behind him.
Yeah,
I remember that, but here's the thing, guys. How do we get rid of him? I mean, like, how do you dislodge him from his position of influence? Because it seems to me it's obvious what's happening in the clip. He tries to derail Mehdi, who, to his credit, does offer some pushback by saying, I met my wife in jail, referring to his participation in the civil rights movement, this kind of hallowed ground. And that is, on one hand, incredibly cynical and demoralizing. On the other hand, it's why that ability to do that, the ability to kind of have this weird special position as Black people in America, at least rhetorically in these kinds of broadly left spaces, makes me wonder if there's more potential for a Black-led left movement than there was for a Bernie-style movement.
I think that any movement that tacks to the left and is successful is going to be led by Black people. It's going to be led by people of color. I mean, you just look at the record of socialist movements across the world. Like, almost every single, aside from the Russian Revolution, just about every single socialist revolution that has been successful in global history has been in Africa, in Latin America, and in East Asia. There's no track record of success that white leftists have had throughout American history that didn't involve throwing Black people under the bus as well. People point to, for example, FDR, and I know I might be stepping on some toes here because Bernie was a candidate that you supported, and he did compare himself very favorably to FDR. But keep in mind that FDR signed the National Labor Relations Act, which essentially excluded about 40% of the Black workforce from labor protections altogether by making sure that people who were agricultural workers and people who were domestic workers were not covered under on those particular labor protections. That's like part and parcel with American history, where it comes to labor protections that include Black people. For example, like the American Federation of Labor was heavily discriminatory against Black workers throughout its history. There's always been essentially a nascent socialist movement in America that essentially kneecaps itself by excluding the most marginalized or the most seen as undesirable populations from being able to participate, and will always strike a bargain with capital to legitimize themselves, which eventually just ends up tearing them down anyway. For example, the exclusion of agricultural and domestic workers from the National Labor Relations Act paves the way for right-to-work states. They essentially eroded labor protections from within by making those exclusions and forcing Black people to have to come in as non-union work. I don't see how it's possible to create a solid, broad working class movement that doesn't put the needs and the history and the tactics of Black people first and foremost.
I put to you all again. What does that start to look like? Does that look like us nominating more Cori Bushes and Senator Turners? Or does it look like figuring out how to harness the energy of last summer and wrest it away from would-be leaders who will lead the millions of people in the streets right back into the arms of the Democratic Party? Do you see what model do you see for a potential revolutionary moment in this country, given especially the fact that despite, the cracks that Pascal was talking about before, in Black America's trust of these leadership figures, it's still toxic, in my life at least, to go and be kind of openly critical of Obama to anybody over the age of 45. The criticisms have to be, perfumed and powdered and gently delivered. And even then are often met with a great deal of hostility. But people, I think, when you don't kind of take an aggressive approach at Black leadership, they're open to the ideas. So how do you start to coax people away from the deep feelings of trust they feel in some of these figures and pave the way for a more kind of revolutionary politics that actually meets the needs of our community?
I think where it starts is
we have to have a working class Black politics, which we haven't had in ages. We haven't had since before the McCarthy era.
Yeah, since the days of Garvey, he hadn't really had that.
I have a question for you guys. How is a working class politics counter hegemonic or offer us any sort of hope for what we're currently facing? I don't see it. For me, there's no empirical evidence to suggest any sort of movement taking place coming out of the West that can salvage, number one, capitalism, offer an alternative to capitalism, or prevent us from what we're currently facing, which is global climate change. In 50 years, the scientists are arguing we will not be able to survive on this planet. So empirically, I don't see any evidence that comes out that demonstrates. If we're not talking about defunding the police, defunding the state, defunding the military-industrial complex, subsistence living, I don't see an alternative. Any movement has to take those into account. It must. It requires that it does.
So, Dr. Mocombe, I would put to you that there's some people who would say I agree with you in theory, but without being specific about how you see us getting there, there's an argument that maybe what you're advocating for could be characterized as, let's say, ultra left. And I'm just new to these terms. I'm not accusing you of that, but let me just get this out. Let me just get this out.
No, it's all right. I feel like anarchist discourse has entered the chat, so I'm good now.
I'm gonna get this out. The discussion as it's been introduced to me, because again, all of this was anathema to me, and I have no dog in this fight. But there's always one camp that's accusing the other camp of being reformist, doing too little, and one camp that's accusing the other camp of being ultra left, which is to say, arguing for things that are so big and bold that they exceed what the public will bear in a moment and basically doom a movement in and of itself. And it's not that I think that what you're arguing for is ultra left, because obviously radical change needs to happen to save us from the climate apocalypse. There's just no option. And anybody who's not speaking in those terms is being a climate denialist. But what I would just ask you to do is to be as specific and grounded as possible in your articulation of what you think that people need to do, as opposed to talking more broadly about what the end state needs to be.
Let me be as specific as possible. Defund the police, defund the military-industrial complex, get rid of the state, subsistence living. How much more specific do you want me to be? And
the question then becomes, how do you convince people that,
Correct.
especially that have just been able to, in the last 30 or 40 years, secure anything remotely looking like a barely middle class existence, because most of Black America does not exist in the middle class, but having just been able to recently secure that, and having just been able to recently secure a tenuous grasp on human rights that are that are supposedly respected by the state, how do you then convince them to go back to subsistence living? I don't know that that's really possible.
I mean, ultimately for me here, this whole project depends on one basic thing that is the root of all type of left politics, whether it be democratic socialists, whether it be revolutionary nationalists, whether it be anarchists. And it's all rooted. All of them, all left political thought and ideology starts with a basic process that no one here can deny. It's called political education. That's the bottom line. Because no one, and the question that I ask, Paul is my good friend. I love Paul, and I read Paul's politics, and I divert in many areas. But the question simply becomes this, and this is why our theme at This is Revolution podcast is non-sectarian leftism. Is our goal to have people become adherents of our particular nuanced left ideology? Or is our goal to be able to improve the quality of life of the lesser of these and make sure they are able to live and function in a society where they'll be able to not be ravaged by the vicissitudes of capitalism and live as successful, functioning human beings without damaging the ecology and the environment and not parasitically living off each other under a capitalist paradigm. For me, my left politics is rooted in making humanity better, particularly for those who are most exploited in the current paradigm. So my question is this for my politics is it more important for me to tear everything down or build an alternative to a system within the particular space I am right now that moves the barometer as far as possible to do what I have already just stated, improve the lives of the lesser of those that I'm concerned about, to have them not ravaged by the vicissitudes of capitalism. For me, that's what my left project looks like.
I'm gonna answer. Oh, go ahead, Brianna. I'm sorry.
Please go ahead, Dr. Mocombe. No, please go ahead.
No. I'm gonna answer Pascal this. My dissertation advisor answered this, and I'm pessimistic, as you all may know, but I'm gonna answer it this way. It's either we change the way we live or we all die. That's the only response I have. That's it. We either change the way we constitute and recursively reorganize and reproduce our existence, or everything we know dies, including ourselves.
But from a structural standpoint, and this is like, and I don't want to I love and respect the both of you. Like I have a lot of regard for both of y'all's work. But here's the question that is very difficult to answer, and I haven't heard anybody substantively answer it. How do you convince the average person to do that, A, and then B, at a structural level, how do you actually accomplish that, right? If you want to talk about, for example, like defunding the military-industrial complex, like that's all well and good to say, but there has to be a strong political interest in dismantling the American military machine. If you want to talk about like changing our lives such that our daily existence is not contributing to the warming of the atmosphere and the destruction of the global south, which will be the first hit in the impending climate disaster. How do you do that without structural work? I mean, the U.S. military is the world's largest polluter by a long shot. We're not going to be able to accomplish, even if all of us were to recombinate our lives to live in yurts, that's still not going to change the structural realities that were as far as airline commuting and travel, as far as the military presence throughout the globe, as far as the way that goods are overproduced in the global south, that labor is exploited, and the overabundance of goods is first consumed in the West and then redistributed throughout the rest of the global south, and then all of our waste, all of the stuff that we would rather not see in front of us, like essentially we're using the rest of the world as our toilet. Those structural realities simply don't change. The amount of pollution that's entering the atmosphere, the amount of plastic waste that's entering the ocean, even if we were to change all of our lives tomorrow, none of that's going to change. So I guess there's two methods to it, and I'm not even really a big fan of political entryism, but there does have to be a larger political project that is essentially socialist or left in nature. I'm not sure exactly what tendency you want to pull towards, but there does have to be a larger left political project that does sort of threaten the hegemony of the two-party system. First of all. And then second, there does have to be a set of incentives for people to begin changing their lives that begins at a structural level, because you're not going to get enough people to sacrifice the realities of their daily existence. Everyone wants to wake up in the morning, drop their kids off at school, go to work, and just live their lives. And you can't add additional stressors to that when that's difficult enough as it is to do to begin with, if it's not coming from a structural standpoint.
Well, I want to respond to this, and I appreciate your commentary, Andray. Thank you very much. And I appreciate, Paul, I feel like I'm in between both of you here. There's one thing, my position is this. Whatever we're going to do, and I agree we have to choose what we're going to do, none of this is happening until we give political education to working class people, black, brown, white, all. okay? And my biggest problem with the left, and we had Adolph Reed on our show, and he actually agreed with us, is that the current manifestation of the left is not serious about mobilizing and organizing working class people. So all of this discourse becomes solipsistic intellectual chattering, because unless we're talking about renting out a gymnasium in my working class black neighborhood and inviting people out of their houses to sit down and say, what exactly are the material realities within the windows of the political options you have right now that can get your government and the state and everyone around you to meet the needs you have as most effectively? This is why, for me, the most important person out of the civil rights movement, a woman who I admire, who I wrote a piece about, is Ella Baker, because she realized we don't need silk suits. We don't need folks with, fancy rhetoric. What we need is to be able to go to the regular common folk and give them the political education to know how to exercise their demands, just like Fannie Lou Hamer did, just like Stokely Carmichael, and show them how to operationalize, mobilize, and organize based on their demands rooted in their working class reality, whether they be black, white, Hispanic, Latino, or Native American. And unless we talk about developing a working class politics, I don't care if you call it left, upside down, whatever, then nothing is going to change.
So I want to hop on that. Okay, go ahead, Dr. Mocombe.
Just quickly,
sure.
I would agree with Pascal. I would just remove, because he sounds a lot like Paulo Freire for a minute there. I would remove the political and just say education. There needs to be a transformative education that takes place in order for us to, if that answers Pascal as well as Brianna. But yes, I agree with Pascal. There needs to be some sort of educational training that takes place for us to find an alternative. Absolutely.
So I appreciate the need for that. And when I reflect on prior, more, radical traditions within our own community that existed prior to today, when I listened to my mother talking about my grandfather, making her listen to Jill Scott Heron when she came home from school as like an elementary school student, and the radical literature that she was forced to read as a kid, and, participating in, the youth Black Panther groups, and saying that, by the time I got to Howard, I had read everything already. I think of that and I compare that to my own life, and I'm like, we have come a long way in the wrong direction. But I'm also curious about what you all think about how the need for that kind of tradition balances against what seems to be the current emphasis for political education on the broad left, not what I would call the left, but among liberals more broadly, is this conversation about CRT. And I'm curious what role you think the sudden conversation about CRT is having, not by the right, because I think it's very clear what the right gets out of stoking this kind of culture war. But what do you think, if anything, the liberal chattering class that seems to be very happy to engage in a kind of CRT pushback that basically says, Nicole Hannah-Jones is our hero, and we're all winning because she got a job, she got a tenure position at Howard, and it's just about teaching slavery in schools. Do you think that there's any tension between the kind of education that we need and the kind of education that's being emphasized right now?
I think that education is what's being offered right now is a complete, constructed, contrived smokescreen financed by the foundation world, the left flank of capital, and the corporate Democrats to keep Black people wedded to the neoliberal flank of the Democratic Party, and while everyone in the post-COVID world is facing massive precarity, to ensure that Black people don't start to consider materialist politics that would require transforming the status quo. This is a con game, because I can remember vividly before Obama took office, Black people like I forgot the author's name, were writing books like The End of Anger, black people aren't angry anymore. They were being interviewed in New York Times articles about the end of black politics. We don't need the civil rights politics like our fathers. This is a new age. I'm not angry anymore. It's a wonderful day. It's a sad comedy for me. I'm older than, folks here to watch black folk go through changes. Some of these folks are MSNBC heads who are now talking about, oh God, I'm looking at the images from the civil rights movement. Back to before Obama, they were saying like we're beyond this race stuff. Everything's fine. Again, why? Because this is a class politics of a class of black people who are unwilling to understand that, as Preston Smith, the political scientist, demonstrates, the racial democracy of race-first politics that we took from the civil rights movement till today gave benefits to a proximate or middle-class proximate class of black people, while the black poor and working class got deindustrialization, mass incarceration, drugs, family dislocation, and got ground to powder, while black folk are watching the Cosby Show and saying, we have arrived, let's go to the vineyard. And these are the same Negroes that are acting as the ventriloquists for the condition of black folk, who want to tell your regular working class folk that critical race theory, something that most of them didn't hear about in their lives, is the do or die issue for black America.
I want to pick up on what you said just there about race-first politics. Because what often happens is that those like us who would want to emphasize material outcomes when advocating for marginalized groups, principally in this conversation, black people, are accused of being class reducunists. But and there's certainly a strain of folks out there that says, racism doesn't matter as long as you solve for class, it solves everything. But the overwhelming majority of people understand that these things are inextricable and need to be addressed in tandem. But what is very much the case in my observation is that race-first politics dominates, even though it's never described that way. Race reductionism is not a phrase that you hear bandied about outside of the Reed household, Adolf and Torre. And what has become very clear to me is that the formula that says we have to solve for racism before we do anything else is obviously a death sentence. Why is that so difficult to convey to folks? Why is there this simultaneous belief that white people will never do anything that helps black people, even if it's in their own interest, because they're just so racist? Why is that simultaneously a belief that neoliberals hold to be true?
First of all,
at the same time, they believe that every kind of politics they should press has to be race first.
Well, I'm going to push back a little bit on the idea that what Black America and the Western black body politic went through it and through the 1970s and 1980s was race first. I don't know that I would call it race first. I would say that it was just race assimilationism. The idea that in order to there was a necessity to be accepted into the broader American body politic, and that's arrived at by being able to aspire to a petty bourgeois class. That was the Cosby style aspirationalism that at least that I saw, and from what I've read. I mean, I was fairly young at the time, but from what I've read, that was what led the conversation, not necessarily conversations on race first. I think what some of these racial conversations end up standing in for, at least as far as I see it now, is this awful sort of representational politics, which some people call identity politics and so on. But what it means is that you want to see a black person on the cover of Forbes magazine. You want to see a black person represented in the vice president's office. You want to see a black person nominated for an Oscar or an Emmy award or whatever the hell. And the idea being that black people being able to validate ourselves is not enough. Being able to analyze ourselves and uplift ourselves is not enough. But you need the broader white society to hold us in high esteem in order for us to feel validated, in order for us to feel truly American or truly Canadian or wherever it is that you're from. I think that to me is the more insidious aspect of racial politics in the last 30 or 40 years. It begins as this idea of racial pride. But what it really boils down to is that you require the validation from people that you see as holding a higher social position than you for it to be valid. I think when it comes to class, sorry, just wanted to get this one point out. I think when it comes to class, we've so effectively obscured the class conversation, which all the way up through the 1970s, I think was just where it came to class and poverty and labor was just prevalent in Black discourse. From everything that I've watched and everything that I've read, I mean, those were very strong conversations that we would have. Even if we were having it intra-racially, like even if we were having it within our own communities, our conversations were very classed. And somewhere around the late 1970s, early 1980s, those began to be completely winnowed out, partially because some of our strongest radicals were assassinated and exiled, and also because the voices of the comprador class, the aspirationalists and striver climbers, were elevated above everybody else. So you had like an academic class that was very happy to, deliver lectures from Harvard on what Black life should be like for people that were never going to come into contact with the academy in the first place.
Right. I don't think that we disagree on any of that. But the question is, why is it that contemporarily and in the last, I would say, several decades, the emphasis, it's not just a kind of Black faces in high places focus of politics. It's people, especially in the Bernie era, who are explicitly arguing that programs like Medicare for All, universal programs, are either tacitly or explicitly racist insofar as they are endeavoring to create some kind of economic equality without first addressing racial inequity. And the idea that a universal program might be implemented, and I'm not talking about New Deal carve-outs that overwhelmingly disproportionately hurt Black people. I'm talking about the kind of, disproportionate effect that comes from the fact that we live in a racist society, right? Like if we, the idea that, well, if we implement Medicare for All, there will still be some maternal mortality gap, means that we have to cure racism first before we address the millions of people struggling with a lack of access to health care.
I have a cynical take on this. I don't think they actually believe anything that there's. I don't think they actually give a fuck about closing the racial wealth gap. I don't think they actually care about trying to solve racism and trying to end white supremacy. I think what happens for a lot of these striver climber types, as I refer to them, like the Joy Reids, swap out pretty much any Black MSNBC host or regular panelist for a Joy Reid. They all have the same politics anyway. I think what really drives them is the need to feel exceptional in front of white people. So if you can most loudly proclaim that racism needs to end and explain to white people why they should feel bad and why they should give Black people opportunities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think when they look at a program like Medicare for All, I think when they're looking at things like broad student loan relief or a complete debt jubilee on student loans altogether, I think because it doesn't set them up to be the exceptional person in the room to have that conversation, they don't want everybody talking about that because they don't get to be the racialized ambassador of that conversation. So I think it's a lot more cynical.
It would be exceptional if Tiffany Cross or Joy-Ann Reid or whatever decided to open their mouth and say on MSNBC, we need Medicare for All because Black people, Latinos,
but who's advertising on MSNBC? You have HMOs advertising on MSNBC. They're not going to threaten that.
That is, I think, a more accurate assessment of what's going on there. So rather than the idea that there is no exceptionality to being an advocate for a universal program on a corporate news network. And I do feel like there are people, they might not be pundits, but when I speak to people all the time, Black people, who very strongly feel like if you aren't advocating for race-first policies, it's an indication that your priorities aren't with the interests of Black people, and therefore you are, if not already selling out Black people, you are going to sell out Black people as soon as there is an opportunity.
First of all, this is a consequence of what this is a revolution called the 50-year counter-revolution, which basically starts in the late 60s, early 70s with the rise of Nixon up until today. We have to realize that for a little bit over 50 years, I mean, I was in college in the 80s. I'm going to date myself. I don't think you guys realize how out of the conception of most Americans' minds who are my age, a conversation about socialism was even possible in this country. Like this conversation that we're having right now would not exist up until the 2008 crash. And what we don't understand is how much the solidity of capitalist realism particularly in the way it moved black politics to the neoliberal right wing of the Democratic Party, starting with the advent of the Clinton DLC third way move in the early 90s, late 80s. And because at that time we had Jesse Jackson, even though he had problems, was still to the left of the party, and moving on into Obama. It is very difficult for us to understand how moving away from a radical socialist agenda that the Black Panthers had, that Martin Luther King had before he died, that Malcolm X, who said, "You show me a capitalist, I'll show you a bloodsucker," that Paul Robeson, Du Bois, that the Black communists, that the African Blood Brotherhood, that the black left anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism goes back, we can go back to the 1880s with the Colored Farmers Alliance. So this notion that challenging capitalism and having class-based politics and even racial solidarity, that does actually end up working for black people, particularly if you look at some of the black communists in the 80s who put redressing black and white communists who put redressing past harms in front of their agenda. That this notion that we can't have coalitions that work is ahistorical, if you look at the actual record, and it's something that particularly black elites like to tell working class black people, that you can't trust those white folk, when we have most of those same Negroes stabbing working class and poor black people in the back, going back to the early 20th century.
Yeah, I see it as as plain as the nose in my face. It used to be, and obviously in some quarters still is, right conservatives explicitly arguing that, Black people are bad, they're racist, weaponizing racism to keep the class, the racial groups apart, working class whites and working class blacks apart. What you see now, and what I think some right-wing commentators in bad faith have picked up on, is that a certain strain of divisive language that says, don't bother with poor whites, they're never going to agree with you no matter what, is coming out of liberals. So you have both parties advocating strongly against a multiracial working class coalition.
Because the biggest fear the ruling class has in this country, and always had since 2016, is having working black people of any stripe in large numbers signing on to a socialist light agenda.
Right, of course. So this is where we started. This is the question that I didn't open with, but came up, maybe 10, 20 minutes into the conversation, which is, isn't there a great deal of revolutionary potential and I don't mean to be overly electoralist or whatever about this, but in a Bernie-style movement, a Bernie-style coalition that has as its figureheads Black and brown faces, as opposed to someone like Bernie Sanders. And what needs to happen on the left, which at the moment is this largely, frankly, and I say this as a member of the bourgeois, elite, highly educated kind of Jacobin left, DSA left, how do you mobilize a Black version of that? That is actually rooted in the working class.
I don't think we should want a Black version of that.
No,
absolutely not of that, but a movement. Obviously,
let me address
the critique is built into the question of the DSA, obviously.
No, I think a part of what's necessary, though, is, and y'all may not like me saying this, but I think it's necessary for there to be an intra-community conversation. Like, there has to be, political education within Black communities first, before trying to link up with the broader working class movement, because we haven't come to anything remotely resembling a consensus in our own communities about what is best for the future of our communities, especially those that are vulnerable on the poorer side and so forth. We're still stuck in this mode of aspirational capitalism that comes out of sports culture, celebrity culture, pretty much everything that we're inculcated with from the moment we're born, through mass media, through our communities, through our families, and so on. We haven't had counter programming to that I think is effective enough that we can create that broad working class coalition. I think starting there is where you begin. And once you have enough people that are educated, that are activated, that are ready to organize, not just mobilize for a protest or a rally or whatever, but for strong long-term organizing. Once you have that established in the community, then I think, yes, you can link that up with movements from other communities and establish that broad working coalition. But we just don't have enough consensus in our own communities for that to happen.
But that's what the Bernie movement was all about. We just a white face on it. That's all it was. It was the same thing, trying to form a broad coalition of the underclass, the working class, to undermine our current neoliberal system. So, and this is where the disingenuousness of CRT on both sides of the equation. Because on the one hand, people like Mark Lamont Hill and all of these so-called left intellectuals, they want to highlight the radical liberalism of CRT, but refuse to emphasize what the right is talking about, which is the negative dialectical component, which says, hey, we need to think against this institution and undermine this institution, because if we don't, it's going to turn into a fascist state. So whereas on the one hand, you have on the left, you're talking about this radical, the radical liberalism of CRT to integrate the masses for equality of opportunity and recognition. But at the same breath, the left refused to recognize the fact there's an element of CRT that says, no, we need to think against the very system by which we're trying to recursively organize our lives in order to change that system. And this is the fear that the right has, because they recognize that within CRT, there is that negative dialectical element that the left refused to acknowledge. So and that speaks to the disingenuous nature of politics in American society, because they're both saying the same thing. On the left, we want equality of opportunity, recognition, and distribution, the radical liberalism of CRT. The left is saying, okay, no. The CRT is dangerous because it's undermining the very system you're seeking to integrate in. So once we get rid of all this chatter and start to really understand at the core of it all is you have two elite groups who are saying the same thing, seeking to integrate into the social system at the expense of the masses of the people. That's the problem.
So that was just the first hour of what ended up being a 2-hour interview. I had invited these gentlemen to come talk to me because I know they're all experts on Haiti, and I wanted them to fill us in on what's going on with the crisis. Because it went long, we ended up putting the Haiti portion of the interview into a separate interview, which you can find if you subscribe at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month. It is the most in-depth, detailed, comprehensive conversation about what's going on in Haiti and how we got there historically, U.S. intervention, the whole 9 yards. Please know that you can find that at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. Also, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and subscribe to this channel.